Hello again. Before turning our attention to Portia and the famous casket test at Belmont, I want to consider Shylock's aggrieved position in Act 2, where we ended last time, a bit more. When Shylock discovers that his daughter Jessica has robbed him and fled with the Christian Lorenzo, he assumes that Bassanio, Antonio's friend, was in on the plot to steal his daughter and his riches. He smells a conspiracy, and he assumes that Bassanio invited him to dinner just so his Christian friends could steal from Shylock while he was away, just so Jessica could join them and escape. Now, Shylock, who almost never dines with Christians, and who normally stays at home to keep a close eye on his fortune and his daughter, makes a departure here, and it proves to be a fatal one. But in truth, his thoughts about Bassanio's involvement are unfounded, because Bassanio has nothing to do with the plot against Shylock, though certainly Lorenzo and Bassanio's close friend Graziano do take advantage of Shylock's absence and also take advantage of the fact that there is a mask procession, a parade going on in Venice at the same time, which Jessica joins in by dressing as a boy. Disguise. Bassanio seems to know nothing about this, however, about this plot, and Jessica and Lorenzo, indeed, are not on the ship, the same ship that Bassanio rushes to board after dinner, a ship bound for Belmont, which Bassanio runs to get onto as soon as he learns that the wind rises, and in fact now they can sail. I noted that the loss of Shylock's ducats and his daughter only intensifies his hatred of the entire Christian community. And this comes at the same time that Shylock hears from Tubal that all of Antonio's ships have allegedly foundered, and that his creditor is therefore ruined, that he will not be able to repay him the 3,000 ducats he borrowed. As a result, Shylock, as he runs through the streets, rants not just about his losses, but also about his bond with Antonio. He demands that Antonio be arrested until he can legally either repay that bond or he can have a pound of flesh extracted from his chest. Now, as we've seen, Antonio and Shylock, these antagonists are surprisingly alike in many ways. And now they have suffered, these formerly rich men, both suffered financial setbacks. Shylock through theft, and Antonio through what appears to be a storm in the Mediterranean. Shylock's rabid desire for vengeance at this point, intensified desire for vengeance, is driven then not just by his personal hatred of Antonio, which is deep and corrosive, this man who was cursed and spat upon him, but it's also driven by his hatred of the entire Christian community of Venice at large. As such, Antonio is then, for Shylock, one might say, both a specific target of a personal hatred, but also a kind of scapegoat for the enmity that Shylock feels for all of Christian society, which he holds responsible for robbing him, for somehow conspiring in this. Shylock's need for revenge, then, has deepened, just as it had earlier, you remember, in Act 1, when Antonio said during their negotiations that he would spit on Shylock again. Even as he borrowed money from Shylock, reaffirmed that he and Shylock would always be mortal enemies. Lend it to me not as thy friend, but thy enemy. It was that kind of language that drove Shylock to formulate a pound of flesh as the bond. But the fact that Antonio functions partly then as a scapegoat at this point raises an intriguing question that has been much debated by critics about Antonio's role in the play. Should we, as some have argued, regard Antonio as the ultimate scapegoat in Christian thought, essentially as a Christ figure? Well, like Christ, Antonio is willing to sacrifice his life to save another, specifically Bassanio. And like Christ, Antonio is the victim of Jewish aggression. The language of the play sometimes, in fact, evokes Antonio's threatened death at Shylock's hands in the language of crucifixion, as, for example, when Bassanio in Belmont hears of Antonio's losses and says this about him to Portia. I should have then told you that I was worse than nothing, for indeed I have engaged myself to a dear friend, engaged my friend to his mere enemy to feed my means. Here is a letter, dear lady. The paper is the body of my friend, and every word in it a gaping wound issuing life blood. Bassanio imagines that the very letter from Antonio is like what he fears Antonio's body will be like, pierced and punctured. Now, it is also notable that Antonio himself sometimes speaks of himself as a sacrificial scapegoat who is being led to death in his efforts to redeem others, specifically Bassanio, from Shylock's economic clutches. He points out more than once that he, Antonio, has bailed out Christians who borrowed money from Shylock and could not repay that loan that they had formed with interest. Thus, we are told at times that Antonio says that he seeks my life, Shylock does. His reason well I know. I oft delivered from his forfeitures many that have at times made moan to me. Therefore, he hates me. Yes. Note that a instance like this, in which he compares himself essentially to one who is saving others at his own expense, is significant because Antonio later draws this implicit parallel of himself as one who is sacrificing himself for others, specifically to Christ. This comes at the beginning of Act 4, when again, Antonio, in his own words, suggests this connection. Antonio observes that he is being about to be devoured by this rapacious Shylock, and he compares himself to a lamb. You may as well question the wolf, why he hath made thee bleat for the lamb. We think here of the Lamb of God, suggestively, in conjunction with Antonio himself, with Shylock himself and Antonio as the Lamb. So throughout the play, then, there are insinuations of this, most of all, I think, when a little bit later Antonio invokes the specific language of the scapegoat to describe himself as one fitted for and about to die for the community. He tells Bassanio, I am tainted wether, that is, I'm an infected ram of the flock, meetest for death, suitable for death. The weakest kind of fruit drops earliest to the ground, so let me. You cannot better be employed, Bassanio, than to live still and write mine epithet. You live, allow me to die for you. I am best suited to death. I am a scapegoat. I am the ram that should be sacrificed or will be sacrificed. Okay, now we're going to see that this kind of language continues. Again, at the trial, Antonio will cast himself even more explicitly as a Christ figure. But I mention this because while the pattern is undeniable, how convincing is it that we should think of Antonio as like Christ? To put it another way, how seriously does Shakespeare want us to take these parallels between Antonio and a scapegoat, and more specifically Christ? Well, Shakespeare certainly problematizes that correspondence because if you think of it, unlike Christ, Antonio doesn't love Shylock as his neighbor, nor does he forgive him as his enemy, both of which Christ enjoined us to do. And as we've seen, Antonio's hatred for Jews is absolutely unremitting and racist. Also, in this regard, it is surely ironic that Christ himself was a Jew, which diminishes the moral legitimacy of the idea that Shakespeare is seriously suggesting that we view the anti-Semitic Antonio as really Christ-like. Finally, we should note a problem even when Antonio casts himself more explicitly as a scapegoat, and that is that even as he says he is going to his death voluntarily, like an infected ram that is suited for death, the problem is, we've seen, that he doesn't really seem to want to live to begin with, that he seems from the beginning so despondent and so moved by a kind of death wish that even before the threat that Shylock's bond poses materializes, he seems already in some way wanting to leave this life, all of which tends in a certain sense to diminish the kind of moral authority of the sacrifice that he suggests at times he's making. In short, it seems to me, Shakespeare seems both to encourage and to subvert the idea of Christ, of Antonio as a kind of Christ analog. And it's just another instance of how deliciously ambiguous this play is. We'll see other instances of this as well. Now, Jessica's betrayal and robbery of Shylock that have so inflamed Shylock's desires for revenge is something that I had talked about last time. And it is part of a father-child theme that runs throughout the play and includes, of course, Portia's relation to her dead father, whom she honors while Jessica breaks her bond with her living father by betraying and robbing him. But in this problem comedy, Shakespeare also gives us a farcical treatment of this same father-child theme in the behavior of the fool's servant, Lancelot, you remember, who works for Shylock, and who, in a curious scene, tricks his blind old father, who has come to Venice in search of his son. Lancelot recognizes the old man and then takes cruel delight in misdirecting him. He says in an aside, "I will try him with confusion." But why? There's no suggestion that the old man has done anything to deserve this, and he seems to love his son and want to find out where he is. Finally, after teasing him and misdirecting him, Lancelot tells his father that your son is dead, before then finally identifying himself as that son. Now, this conversation occurs on a mission that Lancelot has been dispatched for by Shylock. He is on his way to tell Bassanio that, surprisingly, Shylock, who almost never dines with Christians and said he never would, is in fact going to come to dinner that night. And that's significant because that mission in itself, which is the context for this exchange with him and the old man, draws a connection between Lancelot's mistreatment of his father, which occurs in a certain sense in conjunction with Jessica's mistreatment of Shylock, because that mistreatment of Shylock on her part is made possible by the fact that Shylock will be away at dinner at Bassanio's, and indeed Lancelot has been dispatched to make those arrangements. But why does Shylock decide that he will go to this dinner after saying at the beginning of the play that he would never, ever do such a thing? Well, here's what he tells Jessica. "I am bid forth to supper, Jessica. There are my keys. But thenceforth should I go? Why? I am not bid for love. No, I'm not going because I'm friendly toward them. They flatter me just by the invitation. But yet I'll go in hate to feed upon the prodigal Christians. Jessica, my girl, lock up my house. Am I right to go? There is some ill brewing toward my rest, for I did dream of money bags tonight." Well, Shylock says he wants to go to feed. That's his word. To feed with a double sense, okay? I go to feed upon the prodigal Christians. The double meaning there is this. First, he is going to feed or eat up whatever lavish meal Bassanio provides, knowing that Bassanio is characteristically wasteful. He has, after all, run through a fortune. He's using money that, having borrowed it through Antonio from Shylock, he doesn't really have. Thus, he is prodigal. Shylock sees Christians as spendthrifts, while he himself is a miserly man who dreams about protecting those bags of gold, little realizing that that dream was prophetic because he is going to be losing those bags of gold this very night. But the other way that Shylock feeds at this feast is not literal, but figurative. In being with these Christians, he feeds his hatred for them. He goes there precisely to intensify his contempt and his resolution toward revenge. Consider what he says to Salerio after he finds out that Antonio is ruined and can't repay the money that he owes. Salerio wants to know why he would possibly want to follow up and actually act on the bond of a pound of flesh. When Shylock says, "Look, let Antonio, let him look to his bond," Salerio says, "Why, I'm sure if he forfeit, thou wilt not take his flesh. What's that good for?" To which Shylock says, "To bait fish withal. If it will feed nothing else, it will feed my revenge." Again, the idea that he feeds his rage and anger on new instances of sort of Christian behavior, whether it be Christian cruelty or Christian failure. Now, this is interesting because Shylock is linked with eating throughout the play. The Christians see him as a voracious wolf, an image repeated at least twice. And here, Shylock himself descends to that vision of himself as predatory, indeed as almost cannibalistic or vampiric in his aggression, when he says, when asked, "What could you do with Antonia's flesh?" "I'll use it to not only feed my rage all the more for him, but use it to bait fish hooks." That is, use Antonio's flesh to catch something that I will eat. It almost seems as if he wants to consume Antonio's flesh himself. He becomes obsessed at this point with the word bond. Shylock does. Not bond as in bond between father and daughter, familial bond we've seen, but rather now as Shylock invokes the term the legal bond, the contractual bond that binds Antonio to him, the contract that constrains Antonio, that puts his life at risk. This is something that Shylock again and again returns to when he says, "A bankrupt he is, a prodigal who dares scarce now show his face on the Rialto, a beggar that was used to come so smug upon the smart. Well, let him look to his bond. He was wont to call me usurer, let him look to his bond. He was wont to lend money for Christian courtesy, let him now look to his bond, bond." Now, note that later Shylock relishes the sight of Antonio being arrested for non-payment of the loan and is enraged when he hears the word mercy invoked. A little bit later when this occurs, as Antonio is being led off with the jailer, Shylock says, "Jailer, look to him. Tell me not of mercy. This is the fool that lent out money gratis, jailer. Take him, look to him." Antonio then says, "Hear me yet, good Shylock," to which Shylock says, "I'll have my bond. Speak not against my bond, my bond." Well, mercy is for Shylock a dirty word. He will not let the idea of mercy interfere with his bond. And it's a dirty word for him because Shylock knows that Christians use the idea of mercy as a kind of ideal form of conduct, and they preach it, but they never practice it, certainly not toward him. Thus, Shylock said, only a fool would believe that the word mercy has any real meaning for these Christians. And in this conversation that I just quoted, Antonio's reference to, "Oh, good Shylock," that's a matter of pure hypocrisy, something else that Shylock hates in Christians who speak of mercy but never practice it. The idea that in any way Antonio regards Shylock as good is completely dishonest, because you remember when they were drawing up the contract, Antonio had told Shylock to draw it up not for thine friend but for thine enemy, not in love or friendship but in mutual hatred. Yet during this period of the play, when Shylock seems most immune to any common appeals to mercy or friendship or humanity. Immediately after he speaks in that horrifying moment to Salerio of using Antonio's flesh, if for nothing else, to bait fishhooks, what does he do? Again, Shakespeare suddenly pivots and creates a moment in which we feel of necessity greater understanding and sympathy for Shylock after that moment of horror than any other point in the play. He delivers the most powerful, emotionally moving, humane speech in the entire play. It's one that reflects Shylock's aggrieved anger at Christian cruelty and hypocrisy, yes, but which also reveals Shylock's conviction that Christians and Jews share a common humanity that transcends, or should transcend, their differences. Consider. Speaking of Antonio, he says, "He hath disgraced me and hindered me, 500,000, laughed at my losses, mocked at my gains, scorned my nation, thwarted my bargains, cooled my friends, heeded mine enemies." And what's his reason? "I am a Jew. Hath not a Jew eyes? Hath not a Jew hands, organs, dimensions, senses, affections, passions, fed with the same food, hurt with the same weapons, subject to the same diseases, healed by the same means, warmed and cooled by the same winter and summer, as a Christian is? If you prick us, do we not bleed? If you tickle us, do we not laugh? If you poison us, do we not die? And if you wrong us, shall we not revenge? If we are like you and the rest, we will resemble you in that. If a Jew wrong a Christian, what is his humility? Revenge. If a Christian wrong a Jew, what should be his sufferance, his humility by Christian example? Why, revenge. The villainy you teach me I will execute, and it shall go hard, but I will better your instruction." Now, the speech is at once a plea for the Christian recognition of him as a Jew, as a sentient, suffering human being like them. But the speech is also a threat that rebounds on Christians. Shylock says, if we are like you in all of those other ways, we will also be like you in revenge. In fact, I have learned my revenge from you. You have sought revenge on me for being a Jew. I've learned from that, and I will carry it out better than you have taught it to me. Now, in the two film versions of this scene that I asked you to have a look at and sent links to, you'll note that Al Pacino conveys Shylock's sense of noble moral outrage here. Because in that film, Shylock is cast not just as a tragic victim, but really as something of a tragic hero, crying out against injustice. It's an interesting, but ultimately kind of a narrow interpretation. In the other, in Henry Goodman's delivery, in the Trevor Nunn production, there is, at first, more of a sense of sorrow than of moral outrage, almost as if he's about to weep at the description of what Christians and Jews have in common and is so little recognized. But then he pivots suddenly, not so much again to moral outrage like Pacino, as to an uncontrollable anger, and they have to hold him back as he talks about what he has learned of revenge from Christians. Now, revenge, anger, sorrow, and moral indignation, they're all dimensions of that Shylock speech, but the two performances stress different aspects. Well, Shylock delivers this speech to Antonio's friends, Salerio and Solanio, and their response is a chilling illustration of the vilification and racism that Shylock suffers as a Jew, and that he has just lamented. It's clear they haven't heard a word, because they see his friend Tubal coming, and Salerio says, here comes another of Shylock's tribe. A third cannot be matched unless the devil himself turned Jew now. Again, the Jew is devil. Whatever Shylock had said to them fell on deaf ears. But one wonders how even an audience in Shakespeare's time, an audience far less likely to feel a sense of the agony and history of Jewish persecution than we do, would have been able to hear Shylock's speech on stage and not be deeply moved by its humanity, and how such an audience could hear Solanio's response to it, the Jew is devil, and not be disgusted. We'll never know. Okay, let's turn now to the casket test at Belmont. It's not just the lottery of chance that Portia had feared, because it soon becomes clear that her father was a wise man who devised this trial in order to ensure that she marries a worthy individual, because indeed the test measures several different virtues. First, it measures courage, because, as we noted, one must be brave, one must be willing to take a risk and face the loss of ever marrying any other woman just in order to participate in that test. You have to swear you'll agree to those terms, to that particular bond. And up until now, no one has been willing to make that act of courage. Second, the casket test is a trial of intelligence, of the ability to read the inscriptions and read them in relation to the gold and silver and lead caskets. And in reading those inscriptions in relation to those three chests, to infer the deeper meanings and intentions of those inscriptions, what they're really suggesting. Morocco reads these inscriptions aloud before he makes the wrong choice. He says, well then, he says, looking at the three and perusing them before he chooses. First, the gold, who this inscription bears. Who chooseth me shall gain what many men desire. The second, silver, which this promise carries. Who chooseth me shall get as much as he deserves. This third, dull lead, still warning all is blunt. Who chooseth me must give and hazard all he hath. How shall I know if I do choose right? To which Portia says, one of them contains my picture. Not that Portia has seen this test before, but she knows that the correct one contains her picture, but she doesn't know what the correct one is. Now, finally, and most important, Portia's father has designed the casket test as a trial of love. That is to say, a test of the ability to give and hazard all, as inscribed on the lead casket, to give and hazard all in selfless love, and to therefore love Portia herself for more than the love of riches or even her outward beauty, to somehow love her as more than an heiress and as more than merely a beautiful woman. Now, Morocco, the first suitor to enter the competition, one might say passes the test of courage, singularly to this point, just by being willing to enter it. But he fails the other two tests, the trial of intelligence, because he is literal-minded, and the test of love, because he is egotistical. Thus, when he looks at the lead casket and says, hazard for lead, the casket threatens, men that hazard all do it in hope of fair advantages. A golden mind stoops not to show of dross, no. Couldn't possibly be lead. As much as I deserve? Well, yes, I deserve the lady, but then he goes beyond that, because no, not silver either. Let's see. Once more this saying graved in gold. Who chooseth me shall gain what many men desire. Why, that's the lady. All the world desires her. From the four corners of the earth they come to kiss at her shrine. Yes, he will choose gold. Now, Morocco clearly regards Portia as more of a prize to make the world envy him than he regards her as a woman to love. And he completely fails to realize that real love demands a giving and a hazarding of everything for another human being, something that Antonio, by the way, has done for Bassanio in sending him to Belmont. Well, Morocco's egotistical and superficial judgment here causes him to choose the gold casket, and when he opens it, he finds a skull inside with the following inscription. Oh, hell, what have we here? A carrion death, a skull, within whose empty eye there is a written scroll. I'll read the writing. All that glisters is not gold, oft have you heard that told. Many a man his life has sold, but my outside to behold. Gilded tombs do worms enfold. Had you been as wise as bold, young in limbs and judgment old, your answer had not been enscrolled. Well, bear in mind the trope of gold in this play. While there are some images of gold that suggest true value, for example, Portia's golden hair, and Bassanio's reference to her as the golden fleece, and later the golden rings that she and Nerissa give to Bassanio and Graziano. While there are instances of gold as embodying a true value, more often than not, gold is associated in the Merchant of Venice with deception and corruption, as it is here. Gold seduces the eye and therefore deceives the onlooker, and it is linked here not just with deception and misjudgment, but also clearly with greed. And one might say the same is true earlier in the case in which Jessica has stolen Shylock's gold and covered herself with golden ducats, gilding herself in disguise, as she calls it, as she robs him. Again, deception and moral corruption. But why is there a skull inside the golden chest? Well, because, as the scroll suggests, a gilded surface can hide corruption within, even as it tricks and seduces the eye. But also, there's a skull inside to suggest that the pursuit of gold, the pursuit of wealth, can lead to death. Many a man his life has sold, it says, in pursuing gold. We see this throughout literature, as for example in Chaucer's The Pardoner's Tale, where men kill one another out of lust for a bag of gold coins. Well, the next suitor is the Duke of Aragon. Aragon is a region in Spain. And he fails the test of discernment and the test of love by choosing the silver casket. He does so because, like Morocco, he judges from appearances, and like Morocco, is fundamentally selfish and has an exaggerated sense of his own worth. As he peruses the caskets, he thinks, no, I'm not going to take gold. I will not choose what many men desire, because I will not jump with common spirits and rank me with the barbarous multitudes. Let none presume to wear an undeserved dignity, that estates and degrees and offices. So let me instead, he says, choose silver, because he who chooses this gets what he deserves. Clearly, he feels he is fully deserving of Portia. Give me the key to unlock my fortunes here, he suggests. Who chooseth me shall go what he deserves. Well, well said. That's me. Now, note that with this inflated sense of his own merit, he opens the casket confidently, only to behold the image of a blinking idiot. That is, a picture of any man, certainly including himself, who would be foolish enough to make this choice. We're reminded here, again, that Portia's father is making this trial a test of intelligence, a test of discernment. And this is one that Aragon has clearly failed. He says, do I deserve nothing more than a fool's head? Well, here's the inscription inside that goes with that fool's head. What is here? Some there may be that shadow kiss, some but have a shadow's bliss. There be fools alive, I wis, like the figure in the picture, silvered o'er, and so was this. The inscription that Portia's father has placed inside the silver casket compares silver to shadows, because silver tricks us to think that we've found something real, love or bliss, when, like shadows, in fact, we have chosen only something shiny and appealing, only the illusion, if you will, of love or bliss. In short, we choose, as Aragon has, the shadow rather than the real substance, because we are not wise enough or generous enough to see beneath it. The real substance, of course, in this instance, is Portia, okay? And to win Portia, the chooser must see through the alluring deceptions and appeal of both gold and silver, and be willing, instead of taking, to give everything, okay? Rather than, as Morocco and Aragon do, feeling they are either entitled to Portia or entitled to her wealth. Now, Portia has watched these two men make the wrong choices. So at this point, Portia now knows, finally, by process of elimination which is the right casket, the lead casket, as Bassanio prepares to make his choice. Now, this is a fascinating scene because Portia loves Bassanio, has from the very moment they first met years before, and is afraid that he will fail the test, even though Bassanio expresses the same confidence and eagerness to her as he did to Antonio before leaving, feeling in some ways a premonition that he would get it right. Well, when he prepares to take the test, Portia tries to delay his choosing so that she can enjoy his company. She says, no, stay a few months. But Bassanio pushes ahead. Well, having seen the test in operation, Portia still doesn't trust her father's design. And indeed, she regards herself as a kind of sacrificial victim. And one might say, in some ways, recalling Antonio's conception of himself. She says, I stand here for sacrifice. But she compares herself, unlike Antonio, not to Christ as a sacrificial figure in this trial of her father's, but rather she compares herself to the Trojan woman Hesione, who was unwillingly offered up as a sacrifice to a sea monster in order to appease the gods in classical mythology, but was saved at the last minute by Hercules. Well, Portia wants, as she says, Bassanio to save her, to be her Hercules. And so, just as he is about to face the casket, she says to him, go, Hercules, live thou and I live. My life depends upon your ability to make the right choice. Portia knows the casket that Bassanio must choose to win her is the lead one, but she is, of course, as part of the bond, as part of the terms of agreement to her father that she has sworn to abide by, she is forbidden from telling Bassanio. That's part of the arrangement, an arrangement that she has vowed to accept. But does she abide by that arrangement, that solemn promise? Well, this is another wonderful ambiguity. Consider the song that accompanies Bassanio's choosing as he looks at the three caskets, a song that it appears, in the absence of any other stage directions, that Portia is singing. After she says, live thou and I live, we're told, a song whilst Bassanio comments on the caskets to himself. No indication that it could be anyone other than Portia singing it, because it seems to be a continuation of her speech. Tell me where is fancy bred, the song goes, or in the heart, or in the head. How begot, how nourished, reply, reply. It, that is fancy, is engendered in the eyes, with gazing fed, and fancy dies in the cradle where it lies. The longer one looks after a quick glance, the more one's imaginative love or one's superficial enchantment with someone fades. Now, note here that it would seem in this song that Portia might be giving Bassanio a hint here without actually telling him what to do, what casket to choose. But the implication of the song is, don't trust what enchants your eye quickly, because lovers who are enchanted with one another quickly are often deceived when a little bit later they see that what their eyes beheld and delighted in at first glance isn't real. Thus, that kind of love, fanciful love, isn't enduring. It's born of the imagination. She doesn't refer in this song to silver or gold as somehow enchanting the eye and being deceptive, but the implication seems perhaps to be there. And yet, ironically, one might note that it was, after all, through an initial shared gaze on first meeting years before that Bassanio and Portia fell in love, and indeed that love was real. They seemed at that moment to see into one another, to know each other in a way that goes very much against the implication of the song. At any rate, we have to ask, has Portia broken her bond with her father here? Well, I would suggest that technically no, but she certainly comes close, which reveals the desperation of her need for Bassanio to make the right choice. But the fact is that she doesn't seem to betray the bond explicitly, nor, and this is important, nor does it appear, it certainly doesn't betray her bond the way Jessica betrays Shylock, nor does it appear that the outcome of the test, Bassanio's making the right choice, was at all dependent on these hints that she was giving him in the song. Although Bassanio does pick up on the song, it doesn't appear that the song determined his choice, because from the start he already understands that gold and silver are deceptive, pleasing the eye, but not to be trusted. After the song ends, Bassanio says, after they then all join in at the very end, ding dong bell, Bassanio says, "So may the outward shows be least themselves. The world is still deceived with ornament. Hiding the grossness with fair ornament, there is no vice so simple, but assumes some mark of virtue on its outward parts." Anything can be deceptive. Beauty can be deceptive, virtue can be deceptive, love can be deceptive. All of them can seem in some way beautiful when in fact it is not love or virtue at all, or beauty. Now, that's a mature understanding. And as he peruses the caskets, it is almost as if Bassanio has a kind of X-ray vision born of his love for Portia, because he sees, as it were, almost to describe the skull inside the gold chest. He notes that the golden hair of some women that they wear, in fact, isn't their own, but are cut from the head of a dead woman, and then their hair is sold. Here's how he puts it. "So are the cript snaky locks, which maketh such wanton gambols upon the wind, upon supposed fairness, often known to be the dowry of a second head, the skull that bred them in the sepulchre." Thinking that there is, under the beautiful golden hair one sees on women on the street, a skull that used to wear that hair that's now in the grave. So he uses this image of the skull to suggest a kind of deception in what is beautiful and outwardly gold, without ever looking into the golden casket, as if somehow he understands to avoid it. He also compares the gold casket, when he looks to it, to hard food of Midas. Midas was the mythological king who wished to turn everything he touched into gold to become fabulously wealthy, was granted that wish, and then found, of course, that among the things he turned into gold were his daughter, who immediately died, and also the food which he would touch would turn to gold metal so that he couldn't eat it. Well, after dismissing gold and then dismissing silver, Bassanio meditates on the humble lead casket and thinks of it this way. As he sees, he says, "But thou meager lead, which rather threatenst than dost promise aught, thy paleness moves me more than eloquence, and here choose I, joy be the consequence." No hesitation. In fact, he doesn't even have to read aloud the inscription that says, "He chooseth me must give and hazard all." Immediately he makes this choice and understands it. Now, although Bassanio is insolvent and in need of money, and we saw that that was one of his motives to coming to Belmont, he's moved by something in the lead casket beyond monetary value. And this reveals both Bassanio's discernment and his humility. Only a humble man is able to love selflessly without any hope of material gain, and willing to give and hazard all, which Bassanio understands refers not as the other men did, where they thought it referred to money. Bassanio understands it refers to love, to give and hazard all that you have. All that he has is love, and he's willing to give it all to Portia. Well, the emotional response, then, that he has to this humble lead is itself important, because it suggests in Bassanio a capacity to be moved by and to love more than what is just outwardly beautiful. It's not that Portia is not physically beautiful, but somehow the implication is that he's moved by something more authentic in her when he and she exchange that gaze, just as he is moved by something that seems to be deeper and more valuable in the lead casket, which indeed contains her portrait. He's not, in short, a fortune hunter, nor one who feels that he deserves great wealth like Morocco and Aragon. No less fascinating and moving, though, than Bassanio's correct response is Portia's reaction when she sees that he is about to make that correct response. This response to it that she has after so many months of tension and dread that she'll have to marry a nitwit, or more recently, that he will make the wrong choice and that she will lose him. In an aside, after he said that he will choose the lead casket, how all the other passions fleet to air, she says, in the aside to herself, as doubtful thoughts and rash embrace despair and shuddering fear and green-eyed jealousy. O love, be moderate, allay thy ecstasy, in measure reign thy joy, scant this excess. I feel too much this blessing, make it less, for I fear surfeit. It's a great passage. Portia feels so overwhelmed with joy and relief at Bassanio's choice just before he opens the lead casket that she is afraid her ecstasy will overwhelm her, that she'll grow sick with the surfeit of that joy and relief. It's very much the same delirious feeling Othello had on finding Desdemona safe in Cyprus after the storm, when he almost wished that he could die at that perfect moment. Well, what Bassanio finds when he opens the golden casket is, of course, an image of Portia herself. Here in her hairs the painter plays the spider, and hath woven a golden mesh to entrap the hearts of men faster than gnats in cobwebs. Yet look how far the substance of my praise doth wrong this shadow. Yes, the image of you is but a shadow of you. The real thing that it points to is standing outside. Here's the scroll. Be content and seek so new, if you be well pleased with this, and hold your fortune to your bliss. Turn you where your lady is, and claim her with a loving kiss. The portrait is just a simulacrum of what now he can embrace as the real woman, as the real thing, because he has shown he's capable of loving her as a real human being, whereas the other men had not. Now, the gold in her hair in that picture inside the casket is a true gold, as it were. Even though it's an image of her rather than the real thing, it is an image of her beauty, both her outer beauty and her inner beauty. It's not the false gold that lures the greedy, superficial eye, but rather a marker of the true gold. Portia is his reward, a reward for Bassanio's courage, discernment, and a love that will give and hazard all. This moment of happy resolution occurs in The Merchant of Venice much earlier than it does in Shakespeare's other romantic comedies. It occurs in the middle of Act 3, not as it normally does at the end of Act 5. The marriage occurs now, not at the end of the play. But there is a wrinkle here, and one that reveals contradictory impulses in Portia and ambiguities in her complex character. First, this woman who is chafed at being bound to her late father's will, even though she swore she would uphold it, this woman who resented her lack of freedom in being able to choose a husband on her own, now surprisingly tells Bassanio that he is her lord and governor. I mean, this is much more than Bassanio had wanted or expected. He'd hoped to be able to share her wealth, yes, but, to be given her estate and fortune, to have her say, it's in your hands, as am I. She gives this to him when his choice indicated that his love for her was more important than material gain, but he gets the material gain anyway and gets from her a sort of astonishing gesture of absolute obedience, which we wouldn't expect in a woman who very much objected to being obedient to her father's will. She says, speaking to him, but the full sum of me is sum of something, and, to term in gross, I am an unlessoned girl, unschooled, unpracticed. Happy in this, she is not yet old, but she may learn. Happier than this, she is not bred so dull, but she can learn. Happiest of all is that her gentle spirit commits itself now to yours, Bassanio, to be directed as from her lord, her governor, her king. Myself and what is mine to you and yours is now converted. Where did this come from? Well, this seems rather extreme and surprising, doesn't it? to put herself in the governance of a male after resenting obedience to her father's governance? Why does she go so far? Well, Bassanio hasn't asked for it, but more important, she does it not just because he doesn't ask for it, but because she has seen the test that Bassanio is willing to give and hazard all for her. And so this giving of everything that she owns and herself in obedience to him is Portia's answer. It's her way of giving and hazarding all that she has for Bassanio, to surrender herself and her possessions to him, to his governance. This seems then to be both an act of love and also a tremendous act of trust. Well, it's definitely an act of love, an act of reciprocal love, giving and hazarding, but trust? Maybe not. The reason I say that is what happens next, which seems in some way to call into question that trust, and to, again, make us wonder exactly whether she's completely confident in Bassanio. Because what happens next is that Portia seems, even as she is giving herself and surrendering to him, at the same time, to want to pose a test of her own through an act of self-assertion and an act of personal agency. Because in the same speech in which she says, "What is mine is yours, you're my king, my lord, my governor," she then says that I give you then this ring, which when you part from, lose, or give away, let it presage the ruin of your love, and be my vantage to exclaim to you. Why does Portia give this particular special meaning to the ring, which recalls the meaning that Othello attributed to the handkerchief when he gave it to Desdemona? It is yours as a token of my love in you and faith in you as long as you keep it. But if you lose it, well, why? Well, having just seen Bassanio pass the test that her father devised, Portia now wants to impose her own test, a test of Bassanio's absolute love and loyalty. Okay, it is then on her part a gesture of independence and agency. But the gesture also implies a certain lingering doubt that she has about Bassanio. And we recall that despite Bassanio's confidence from the beginning that he would choose the correct casket, Portia doubted him enough and feared that he'd make the wrong choice enough to want to keep him in Belmont for months in order to delay that choice. Okay? Even after the right choice, there's still some residual uncertainty. What seems like residual doubt, however, I think, might actually be more Portia's need to assert her own will after bowing to her father's, to make the ring test a test of Bassanio's love and fidelity on her own terms, not her father's, even though at the same time she once and did try to reciprocate Bassanio's giving and hazarding all by offering not merely herself, but her entire fortune. So in a strange way then, even as Portia seems to surrender to patriarchy by giving all she owns to Bassanio as lord and master, she also resists patriarchy at the same time here, as she will later by dressing as a male magistrate. She does here by setting her own terms in the marriage, by instituting her own test of Bassanio's love and loyalty. Now, note too that Bassanio, at this point, hears immediately thereafter that Antonio has been arrested with his life at risk for non-payment of the 3,000 ducat loan to Shylock. And knowing this, he immediately determines that he will go back to Venice, and he does so with Portia's explicit blessing. But this happens so abruptly that although the pair have time to marry before he departs, they don't yet have time to consummate their marriage. In short, there's no wedding night. The golden ring, then, that Portia gives to Bassanio is, among other things, a kind of promise of the consummation to come, provided, that is, that Bassanio doesn't lose it or give it away. As a token of love, the ring also recalls something else. This ring, and of course it's mimicked by the ring that Nerissa also gives to Graziano, but the ring that Portia gives to Bassanio recalls the one that Shylock received from his late wife Leah, who gave it to him before they were married, another ring given by a woman to a man, the ring that, among others, Jessica stole. And that was a ring Shylock said that he valued beyond any gold or any material wealth. So rings then seem to be associated with something in a relationship that involves a fidelity and a bond of love quite independent of any other measure. The emotional value, to put it simply, that Portia and Shylock both put on these rings has the effect of linking these two characters in their own emotional depth and in their own devotion to their spouses. In sum, Portia's seemingly contradictory responses to Bassanio after he makes the right choice reflects her desire to match his giving of all to her with her own giving of all to him, while at the same time asserting her own will to ascertain on her own terms his complete worthiness as a husband. When Bassanio tells Portia about Antonio's plight in Venice, Portia puts off then the night of bliss and instead encourages Bassanio to sail back directly to support his friend. She tells Bassanio because the two of them, as husband and wife, are joined spiritually in their love, their spousal love, and because Bassanio is joined in spirit, in the spirit of bosom friendship to his love for Antonio, then in a certain sense, that bosom friend and benefactor is joined to her in spirit through Bassanio. That through Bassanio, even though she's never met Antonio, she feels a spiritual alliance or a spiritual bond with the man. Now, this is what she means then when she speaks of feeling that Antonio is, quote, the semblance of my soul. At the same time, we have to note, Portia also feels a debt of obligation to this man she's never met, to Antonio. She knows from Bassanio that were it not for Antonio's risky financial support, Bassanio would have never been able to come to Belmont and win her, that she owes her happiness, in short, to Antonio. Thus, Portia feels that she must save Antonio for several reasons. First, out of love to Bassanio, who is burdened by the threat that Antonio faces, and she doesn't want to see her husband suffer. Second, out of the spiritual bond that she suggests she and Antonio now have forged, even though they've never met, through the man that they mutually love and are loved by, Bassanio. And finally, she's motivated to try to save Antonio by a sense of indebtedness and the guilt she feels that have arisen from Antonio's generosity. Well, with Bassanio away, Portia now has time to hatch her own plan to remove the threat to their marital happiness, very much the way female protagonists in Shakespeare's other romantic comedies typically do. And often, like Portia, they do so by disguising themselves as males so as to intervene in the patriarchal world. Now, all of the motives that I've described for Portia's scheme of disguising herself as a lawyer are significant, okay? But there is another motive for her particular determination that she will save Antonio by impersonating a man. And it is one, I think, that drives Portia's undertaking this legal stratagem as much as any of the others. A stratagem in which she will arrange, with the help of a famous judge in Padua, to be sent to Venice to adjudicate the case of Antonio in his bond with Shylock. Doing so, dressed as a male, gives Portia, who has been so long repressed unhappily by patriarchy, even as a rich woman, it gives her an opportunity to impersonate a powerful man, to experience in doing so the freedom and authority and respect that men command within the social order, so that there is this sort of personal motive for saving Antonio, quite apart from the others that I have mentioned. And we get a sense of how she's motivated in part by this desire for male impersonation when, after Bassanio leaves, she hatches this plan with Nerissa, and she says, we'll see our husbands before they think of us. They won't know we're actually dressed as men here. They'll take us for men. Nerissa, shall they see us? Ha! They shall, Nerissa, Portia says, but in such habit that they shall think we are accomplished with what we lack. That is to say, they will imagine that we have penises, which we lack. I'll hold thee any wager. When we are both accoutred like young men, I'll prove the prettier fellow of the two, and wear my dagger with the braver grace, and speak between the change of man and boy with a reedy voice, and then 2 mincing steps into a manly stride, and speak of the phrase I'm in like a fine bragging youth. I have within my mind, Nerissa, 1,000 raw tricks of these bragging jacks, which I will practice. Okay. Now, note here that Portia, who has complained bitterly to Nerissa in the past about her impotence as a woman, relishes the idea of going out into the world dressed as a male, disguised, and giving orders and prancing about and enjoying the liberties of being thought a man. But even as she describes this with relish, she also reminds Nerissa of how really silly most male behavior is, how much masculinity is so much a social performance more than anything else. The way in which men speak, their style of dress, their strutting or mincing steps, all of these things, as they construct their masculinity, she sees as rather silly. So Portia then envies male freedom even as she sees male behavior as rather ridiculous. Now, if Shakespeare, as I suggested earlier, posed the question of whether Jessica's religious identity as a Jew was something inborn and intrinsic, or merely a matter of custom and social manners, things that can be erased, at the same time, I think, he makes a similar inquiry about the nature of gender. Is gender, our maleness or femaleness, innate, or is it really more socially constructed by forms of outward behavior of the kind that Portia describes men engaged in? Portia implies that it is mostly the latter. But she's curious and she'd like to know herself, as she imagines herself imitating men whom she's seen. So if she's going to save Antonio, she wants at least to know what it's like to have a sense of male power in the process of saving him. Now, there is, of course, an additional layer of irony in Portia's comic words about how men act. An Elizabethan audience would have been watching 2 young men on stage playing Portia and Nerissa as women and preparing to dress as men in disguise. This double layer of irony makes Portia's remarks a sly commentary on the convention of men playing women on stage, implying that just as gender is constructed on stage by actors playing women, so too gender in real life is largely a matter of performance. Isn't that neat? Meta. Meanwhile, Jessica and Lorenzo have arrived at Belmont, fleeing Venice and fleeing, more particularly, Shylock and those that Shylock has dispatched to try to find them. They have come seeking shelter and protection from Portia, and she grants it, of course. As Lorenzo is a friend of Bassanio's, there is really no question about it. But consider Jessica's state of mind here. Remembered she had expressed guilt for betraying her father even before she did so, and now she still seems troubled in ways that Shakespeare suggests rather subtly. Jessica believed that she could become a Christian and assimilate fully into Venetian society by marrying Lorenzo and by doing so as his Christian wife. She said that she was, yes, of Shylock's blood, but not of his manner. Thus, she suggested she was not indelibly or intrinsically or incontrovertibly a Jew. When she said that to Salanio, he agreed with her. But the fool Lancelot cast doubt on that possibility that Jessica can ever really be Christianized and thus accepted within Christian society as anything other than a Jew, when he makes this rather rude comment. Lancelot says to her, he too has come along to Belmont, "Yes, truly, for look you, the sins of the father are laid upon the children. Oh, yes, therefore I promise you, I fear you, I was always plain with you, and so now I speak of my agitation of this matter. Therefore be of good cheer, for truly I think you are damned." Jews are damned. You're a Jew, no matter what happens, no matter what you think Christianizing will do. Yeah, you're going to pay for your father's sins. You're damned. Sorry about it. Mary, Mary, you may partly hope that your father had got you not, that you are not a Jew's daughter. Your only hope would be somehow if you're not a Jew, and the only way Lancelot says that could be the case is if you can somehow prove that Shylock isn't your father. To which Jessica says, "No, I shall be saved by my husband. He hath made me a Christian." This is actually a very rich exchange here. First of all, the fool Lancelot, well, he raises an interesting question about the extent to which Jewishness is intrinsic or constructed. He's certainly wrong about one thing. In Jewish tradition, what makes you a Jew isn't your father, as he claims, whether your father is Jewish or not. Rather, it all depends on whether your mother is Jewish or not. Why? Because as the captain knows all too well in Strindberg, only a woman can know for sure that a child is hers, not a man. And the Jews all the way back in time in memoriam understood that. So the lineage of Jewish identity comes from the mother, not the father. All right. Now, it turns out that, of course, Jessica's mother was also Jewish. But when Lancelot says, well, I hope your father wasn't, it makes no difference. It goes through the mother. Still, his claim that Jessica inherits her father's sins, the sin of being a Jew, upsets her enough to make her insist yet again that Lorenzo will, quote, save her as my husband. Now, that word save is a very rich word. We know already that we have Portia going off to save Antonio, okay? But the way in which Jessica uses this word here suggests a collection of different possible ways in which she hopes to be saved through this marriage to a Christian man. First, it suggests she wants to be saved by Lorenzo in marriage to him in a religious sense, the sense of redemption, of being a Christian so that she can benefit from Christ's redemption of mankind, or at least of Christians, and go to heaven the way a Jew cannot. Because remember, Lancelot has just said, you're damned. You're always going to be a Jew and you'll therefore go to hell. Okay? So in a theological sense, she wants to be saved. The idea of redemption is important to Jessica in particular, though, because she feels she has sinned. She knows she has sinned, in fact, by betraying and robbing her father. And this gets at a second sense of save, as in by marrying Lorenzo and therefore becoming capable of God's forgiveness, I will be freed from my guilt by becoming a Christian, therefore capable of being forgiven by a loving God. Finally, Jessica seems to mean saved, I think, in a social sense. She hopes that Lorenzo will save her from her status as the racial other, as the Jew, and integrate her into the dominant social fabric of Christian Venice when they are able to return safely. Now, all of this depends upon her being Lorenzo's Christian wife. But Shakespeare makes us wonder if Lorenzo is going to continue to love Jessica as a Christian, because he seemed drawn to her precisely because of her exotic racial and religious difference. Lancelot tells her, by the way, in the same conversation, that he himself has impregnated a black woman, a Moor, presumably because Lancelot was drawn to her difference. But that was definitely not love. He wants nothing more than to get away from her and all responsibilities. Well, it's an interesting little piece of information because at such moments, Shakespeare hints that Jessica's unease about her hasty marriage, which is meant to save her in the ways I've suggested, is one that arises not just from the guilt she feels toward her father, but also from certain doubts she has about Lorenzo. Remember, she felt that she needed to bring stolen wealth with her, almost as if she devalued herself as a Jew, as a person, and doubted whether Lorenzo would ever be satisfied with her alone as a Jewish woman if she didn't somehow bring along this collateral wealth. Well, as noted, Jessica's betrayal of her filial bond with Shylock makes her a foil for Portia, who abides painfully by her father's will. But Portia is rewarded. Jessica, on the other hand, violates the bond with Shylock, and while we can't say she's punished, she certainly seems distressed and uncertain and unhappy. She seems to see, in some way, the difference between herself and Portia very clearly and very painfully. And I think this is why, when she arrives at Belmont, she speaks in such extravagant praise of Portia as a woman she regards as perfect in every way, a woman of heavenly goodness who got a loving husband because of that goodness, because she honored her bond with her father rather than breaking it. Jessica's veneration of Portia, in short, I think, reflects her own guilt and her doubts about her own marriage. Consider what she says, talking to Lorenzo. How dost thou like Bassanio's wife, he asks, to which Jessica says, past all expressing. It is very meet, the Lord Bassanio, 5 an upright life, for having such a blessing in his lady. He finds the joys of heaven here on earth, and if on earth he do not merit it, in reason he should never go to heaven. Yeah. If he can't live up to the marriage with this woman, then he doesn't deserve heaven, because this woman is heavenly. Jessica sees Portia as sanctified by God, blessed, almost as a celestial being on earth. Now, whether or not Portia can live up to that kind of description in the audience's eyes will prove an intriguing question, and a difficult one, as we turn now to the trial in Act 4, the climax of The Merchant of Venice. I'm going to be discussing most of this in the next lecture, but I want to spend a few minutes today beginning and setting up the scene. The scene at court presents Shylock at his most unappealing. He is insistent, predatory, bloodthirsty, merciless, unyielding. And yet we can also understand why he behaves this way when he rejects the appeals of those who say you must show mercy to Antonio. These appeals to show mercy, this expectation, comes not just from Antonio's friends, but also from the Duke of Venice himself. And these requests merely enrage Shylock, deepen his commitment for a pound of flesh, because these assumptions are, in his eyes, a quintessential manifestation of the Christian hypocrisy that he has reviled and always hated. Christians expect mercy from a Jew, and they preach mercy, but of course they don't show it themselves, least of all to Jews, and least of all to Shylock as a member of his race. Shylock is also aware of something the audience can't help but see. These appeals and assumptions that Shylock will behave mercifully are rooted in the idea that you'll behave like a human being. And that marks a drastic shift in the way in which the Christian community normally speaks to and about Shylock. Even when Portia arrives on the scene in disguise, she says immediately, quote, then the Jew must be merciful. Shylock says, by what? By what law must I be merciful? Shylock despises such assumptions, not just because the mercy itself that Christians speak of is hypocritical, but also because up until now, the Christian community has described him as inhuman and therefore incapable of mercy or forgiveness. As I noted last time, they often refer to him as a devil, and in other cases, they refer to him as non-human by framing him as an animal, as something not really human, but rather subhuman. Consider, for example, the racist Celerio speaking. He says, now, never did I know a creature that did bear the shape of a man so keenly and greedy to confound a man but Shylock. He bears the shape of a man, but he's not really a man. He's something other than a man. He's something beneath a man. Even the Duke himself, at the beginning of Act 4, says to Antonio, thou art come to answer a stony adversary, an inhuman wretch, incapable of pity, void and empty. Okay, and yet the Duke, a little bit later, makes an appeal to Shylock to show mercy as a human being, completely contradicting this dehumanized view of him that he and the others have. Well, Antonio, who, when he was being arrested, said, oh, good Shylock, that doesn't last very long. Antonio maintains his dehumanized view of Shylock even during the trial, while the others are trying to insist that the Jew, of course, must act like a human being. Antonio, in his bitter hatred, can't even go that far. He says, you may as well do anything but anything most hard as seek to soften that heart than wrench, though it's harder, his Jewish heart. Why? You might as well question with the wolf why he hath made the ewe bleat for the lamb. Yeah, Shylock is a wolf. He's a predator. He's subhuman. You can no more reason with him than you could a beast, a ravenous wolf. Now, note that Antonio can only see Shylock then as a rapacious beast, even now, which, while horrifying, you could say, is at least consistent because the others, like Salanio and the Duke, conveniently want to frame Shylock as human in order to try to persuade him to be merciful. All of it hypocritical. Antonio, on the other hand, does not expect mercy, nor, one might argue, does he necessarily really even want it, because as we've seen, he doesn't really seem to want to live. Now, Shylock's most powerful speech, Hath not a Jew eyes, hands, dimensions, had attempted to demonstrate that Jews share humanity with Christians, that they feel and suffer in the same ways, but also that members of both races seek revenge in the same spirit, as Shylock is now seeking it, driven to it by the hatred of Christian hypocrisy, as well as the hatred of Christian abuse. He had spoken to Jessica of Christians out in the streets with their painted faces. It's a line that suggests not just the masks that they wear in this procession, but their dishonest faces, because they will change those faces when necessary to get what they want, as when they want mercy, when they offer none, and treat Shylock as someone who they regard as human, when in fact they never have before. When Shylock proves to be obdurate and rejects all these appeals to forgive Antonio his debt, then, and only then, does the community return to their view of him as bestial, demonic, inhuman, and we realize that they never really regarded him as like themselves to begin with, never really regarded him as human, but only pretended to do so to try to get Antonio out of this bloody bond. Consider Graziano's venomous accusation, and then consider Shylock's response to it. Graziano says that it's held in Pythagoras that the souls of animals infuse themselves into the trunks of men. Thy churlish spirit, Shylock, is governed then by a wolf, hanged for human slaughter. Thy desires, Shylock, are wolfish, bloody, starved, and ravenous. To which Shylock says simply, I stand here for law. Shylock repeatedly says he stands for law, the letter of the law, the contract of the bond that he and Antonio agreed to, that they signed. It is this that he insists the Duke enforce, or else abrogate the laws of Venice, which would be dangerous for trade. But as we'll see next time, there is a higher law for Shylock that he is invoking and honoring besides the legal contract, a law that he sees as even higher than that and that he clings to in enforcing its bond. It is, as we'll see for Shylock, a religious law, not the Christian law of love and mercy that they preach but don't act upon, but rather the law of the Old Testament, the law of the God of Moses, to whom Shylock has made a solemn pledge to stick to his bond. It's the law that prescribes not mercy, but an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. Okay, next time we are going to spend the first half of the lecture finishing The Merchant of Venice, and the second we'll devote to Molière. First, background on Tartuffe. Then I'm going to be talking about the nature of satire using a sheet of quotations that I will send to you with the next lecture. And then we'll talk about the opening of Tartuffe. So please, for next time, read Act 1. Okay? See you then.